In this video, we dive into 3 terrifying tales of midnight horror. First, a security guard is haunted by mysterious phone calls in the dead of night. Then, a nurse hears a child's cry echoing through the haunted hospital basement. Finally, a factory worker faces a shadowy figure that knows all his darkest secrets. If you think you can handle the fear, let's begin. The Midnight Caller. Josh Wheeler adjusted his cap and settled into the leather chair at his post inside the dimly lit lobby of a towering isolated office complex. It was 2 a.m., the infamous witching hour, and all was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. A graveyard shift wasn't exactly thrilling, but Josh preferred the solitude over daytime chaos. His radio crackled, static. A chill crept down his spine, but he brushed it off as an overactive imagination. Then, the phone on his desk rang. Startled, Josh stared at the phone's LED screen. Unknown. Caller. He hesitated, but then picked up. Hello? The line hissed with static, and then a distorted voice whispered, I'm watching you. Josh's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? But the only reply was the faint, eerie sound of breathing. Then, a click. Josh exhaled, shaking his head. Prank call, he reasoned, though the hairs on his arms stood on end. Setting the phone down, he decided to check the building's CCTV footage, scrolling through each camera view. The empty corridors and vacant offices stared back at him, still and undisturbed. Just as he began to relax, the phone rang again. Heart pounding, he picked up. Look, whoever this is, stop messing around. The distorted voice returned, this time with chilling clarity. I see you, Josh. You're at the front desk. Alone. Aren't you? His breath caught. Only a handful of people even knew he was on duty tonight. Who are you? He demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. Silence. Then, in a barely audible whisper, check the south wing. Josh's hand hovered over the CCTV monitor. The south wing was supposed to be locked, unoccupied, until the morning. Switching to that camera feed, he scanned the hall. Empty. He was about to dismiss it as a hoax when, in the far corner of the screen, he saw a shadow slip past. Josh's heart pounded as he zoomed in. The shadow disappeared from view, but he had seen it. Someone or something was in the building. Summoning his courage, Josh grabbed his flashlight and radio. He stepped into the corridor, every shadow feeling like it was watching him. Every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. As he moved towards the south wing, the phone on his belt buzzed. Startled, he checked it. Unknown caller. His throat tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pressed forward, his footsteps echoing against the polished tile floors. At the south wing entrance, he found the door unlocked, despite his checklist confirming it had been secured earlier. Pushing it open, he aimed his flashlight into the darkness. Is anyone here? He called, voice wavering. A faint, ghostly voice whispered from behind him. Over here, Josh. He spun around, aiming the beam in every direction, but found only empty air. He forced himself to move forward, each step feeling like he was walking deeper into some waking nightmare. Finally, he reached room 213, the room where the calls were supposedly coming from. With a shaky hand, he tried the door. It creaked open, revealing a small, dust-covered office. An old rotary phone sat on a desk in the middle, coated in a thick layer of grime, as if untouched for years. Yet, as he stared at the relic, it began to ring. Josh's heart thundered in his chest. Trembling, he lifted the receiver, half expecting to hear nothing at all. But the distorted voice greeted him again. "You shouldn't have come, Josh." A metallic click echoed through the receiver, followed by static, and then screams. Horrible, echoing screams. He dropped the phone, stumbling back, his mind racing. On the desk, he spotted a dusty stack of papers. As he shuffled through them, his blood ran cold. They were employee records of past security guards, men he had heard whispers about, men who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances while working the graveyard shift. Every one of them had left a final report mentioning strange phone calls from room 213. A surge of dread washed over him, and he turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room was freezing now, the shadows seeming to press closer, wrapping around him like icy fingers. The phone rang again, this time with a deafening shrillness. Against his will, he picked it up, his hand moving as if possessed. The voice on the other end was clear, almost human now, but dripping with malice. "Now you're one of us, Josh. You can't leave." With a flash, the lights flickered, and he saw them. Pale faces, eyes hollow, surrounding him in the shadows. The spirits of the past guards, their mouths open in silent screams. The last thing he heard was the distorted voice whispering in his ear, "Welcome to the graveyard shift." When the morning guard arrived, there was no sign of Josh Wheeler. Only the phone in room 213, off the hook, buzzing softly with static in the silence. Second story. The hospital basement haunt. Lily had only been a nurse for 2 weeks when she was assigned the night shift at St. Mark's Hospital, a place rumored to be haunted. Her colleagues spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences, especially down in the basement, where old equipment and files were stored. Lily had laughed it off, chalking it up to superstitions and late-night imaginations. But tonight, standing alone in the dimly lit corridor, those stories didn't feel so funny. The hospital was eerily quiet at 2 a.m., the usual bustle replaced by the distant hum of machines. Her checklist included a quick inspection of the basement, a task she had put off all night. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the basement, feeling a twinge of anxiety. The elevator doors opened with a shudder, revealing the cold, dimly lit basement corridor. Rows of unused wheelchairs and gurneys lined the walls, their metallic surfaces casting faint reflections. Lily hugged herself against the chill, her footsteps echoing as she walked down the hall. Suddenly she heard it, a faint muffled sound. She froze, her heartbeat quickening. It was a child's cry, soft and sad, drifting from somewhere further down the corridor. Maybe it's just my imagination, she thought, but the sound grew louder, pulling her forward. She followed it, her pulse quickening with each step. As she rounded the corner, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A small, empty wheelchair was moving on its own, slowly rolling across the hallway. Lily's heart hammered in her chest. She stared at the chair, her mind racing for a logical explanation, but there was none. It was as if an invisible hand was pushing it, guiding it to the end of the hall where it finally came to a stop. Swallowing hard, she approached the chair cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, a chill ran up her spine, and she heard the child's cry again, closer this time. A lump formed in her throat. She had to get out of here. Turning on her heel, she rushed back towards the elevator, but as she reached for the button, her hand stilled. The doors refused to open. She pressed the button again and again, but the light didn't even flicker. A sense of dread settled over her, and she turned back to the hallway, scanning her surroundings. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint echoes of her own breathing. Determined not to let fear consume her, Lily took a deep breath and headed back down the hall, hoping to find another exit. Her footsteps echoed as she moved deeper into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. She found herself in front of a small, dusty door she hadn't noticed before. Something about it felt wrong, but she was out of options. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The room was filled with old medical records stacked haphazardly on shelves. In the center, a lone hospital bed sat under a flickering light. There was a strange feeling in the room, an overwhelming sense of sorrow and loss. Lily's eyes fell upon a small nameplate on the bed. Patient 303, Jeremy. She felt a pang of sadness, though she didn't know why. Just as she was about to leave, the sound of quiet sobbing filled the air again, this time so close she could almost feel it. She turned around slowly and her heart skipped a beat. Standing at the edge of the room was a small, pale figure, a boy no older than 6 wearing a hospital gown. His eyes were hollow, dark pools that seemed to absorb the dim light. Tears streaked down his face as he looked at her, his expression a mixture of sadness and despair. "Are you Jeremy?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "They forgot me," he said, his voice thin and broken. "They left me down here alone." Lily's heart ached for him, but fear gripped her too. She had heard stories of patients who were temporarily stored in the basement when the morgue was full, sometimes forgotten for days. But a child? The thought was unbearable. "I'm so sorry," she said, taking a cautious step towards him. "I didn't know." The boy's eyes glistened with a strange light. "Will you stay with me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't want to be alone anymore." A wave of sadness washed over her, but survival instincts kicked in. She needed to get out of here. I can't, Jeremy. I have to go back upstairs." The boy's expression darkened, his figure beginning to flicker like a broken projection. "They all say that. They all leave me." His voice dropped, an edge of anger slipping into his tone. "You're just like them." The lights began to flicker violently, casting eerie shadows across the room. Lily backed up, her hand fumbling for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. "Please let me go," she whispered, panic rising in her chest. Jeremy's face twisted with rage, his form distorting as he moved closer. "Stay with me," he hissed, his voice no longer that of a frightened child, but something far darker. "Forever." Lily screamed, pounding on the door as the boy's figure loomed closer. Cold hands seemed to wrap around her, pulling her towards the bed. She fought with every ounce of strength, her mind racing with images of her family, her friends, everything she would leave behind if she didn't escape. Just when she thought all hope was lost, the lights stopped flickering, and the door behind her swung open. She fell backwards, scrambling out of the room, her heart racing. Without looking back, she ran down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall, as she finally reached the elevator. The doors opened this time, and she stumbled inside, jabbing the button for the main floor. As the elevator rose, she glanced at the basement one last time. Jeremy's face appeared in the crack of the closing doors, watching her with hollow, empty eyes, his silent scream echoing in her mind. When she reached the main floor, Lily bolted from the elevator, gasping for breath. She never went down to the basement again, but sometimes, late at night, she would hear the faint sound of a child crying from far below, reminding her of the boy who would always be waiting for someone to stay. Third story. The factory's final hour. Tom had worked as a maintenance technician at Westline Factory for years, long enough to know every creak, clang, and hum of the building. It was an old place with its walls marked by decades of machinery, oil stains, and rumors. During the day, the factory bustled with workers and the constant thrum of machines, but at night it was different. A cavernous, silent shell where every sound seemed to echo. On his overnight shifts, Tom often felt a strange unease, especially in the older sections of the factory. He'd hear machines whir to life briefly, only to stop as soon as he got close. Sometimes, there were heavy footsteps in the empty hallways, though he'd always find himself alone when he turned around. His co-workers told him stories of a tragic accident that had happened years ago. A worker named Henry had died in a freak machinery incident in one of the assembly lines. Since then, strange occurrences had plagued the factory at night. Tom shrugged off the stories as superstition, chalking them up to the quirks of an aging building. But as the weeks wore on, he began to wonder if there was more to it. One night he was inspecting the old assembly line area where the accident had supposedly happened. His flashlight flickered as he stepped through the dimly lit aisles, the beam casting long shadows across the walls. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the hall behind him, like a wrench dropping onto metal. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. Just as he started to turn back, he heard it. A faint whisper over the intercom, so soft, he almost missed it. Tom. A chill ran down his spine. It wasn't possible. The intercom was only used by security and the shift manager, and they were supposed to be on the other side of the building. Forcing himself to stay calm, he pressed the button on his walkie-talkie. "This is Tom. Did anyone call me just now?" Only static replied. He stood in silence, his heart pounding. Then the whisper returned, louder this time. "Tom, come to the assembly line." The hairs on his arms stood up. The voice was strange, distorted. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the assembly line, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. As he reached the center of the room, a machine suddenly roared to life. The clanging and grinding of gears filled the space, and Tom staggered back, his heart racing. He hadn't turned it on. It was supposed to be deactivated. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The only response was the machine's relentless clanking. He stepped closer, peering at the controls, when he felt a cold breeze sweep across his neck, carrying with it a voice. A whisper that chilled him to the bone. "I know you, Tom," it said, soft and menacing. "I know everything." Tom stumbled backward, the weight of the words sinking in. He had secrets, things he hadn't told anyone, things he thought were buried in the past. His hands shook as he looked around, feeling utterly alone and exposed. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. Silence. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting in the corner of the room. He turned his flashlight toward it, and the shadow took shape. A tall, imposing figure standing in the darkness, its features shrouded, but its eyes gleaming like embers. You can't be real, Tom whispered, backing away. The figure stepped forward, moving with an unnatural fluidity, its gaze never leaving him. I know what you did, Tom, it hissed, its voice echoing through the empty hall. You can't hide from me. Tom's mind raced, memories flashing through his head. Years ago, he'd made mistakes, costly, hurtful ones. Things he had tried to bury, things he thought no one knew. Who are you? He asked, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, the outline of a twisted smile forming on its shadowy face. Don't you remember, Tom? Don't you remember what happened here, in this very room? A sense of dread washed over him as he realized the truth. Henry, he whispered, barely able to get the word out. The figure's smile widened, and it nodded slowly. You all left me, it whispered, its voice filled with bitterness. Forgotten. Just another accident, but I never left. I've been here, waiting. Tom felt his legs weaken. He remembered hearing about Henry's death, the whispers of negligence, of ignored safety protocols. He hadn't been responsible, but he'd heard the stories, the accusations against management. Yet Henry's ghost was looking at him, singling him out. I had nothing to do with it, Tom stammered, his voice desperate. The figure's eyes flared. You all turned a blind eye. You let me die, alone, in the cold. And now, you'll join me. The machine roared again, louder this time, the noise so deafening that Tom covered his ears. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. He pounded on it, shouting, but no one came. The shadowy figure was right behind him now, its breath cold on his neck. Don't be afraid, Tom. It's almost over. Just like it was for me. Tom's vision blurred as panic took over. He could feel the coldness seeping into his bones, as if the life was being drained from him. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, his strength fading. As his vision darkened, the last thing he saw was Henry's twisted smile, watching him with an eerie satisfaction. When the morning crew arrived, they found Tom lying on the cold factory floor, unconscious, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. They revived him, but he could barely speak, muttering incoherently about shadows and whispers. From that day forward, Tom refused to work the night shift, avoiding the factory's assembly line at all costs. But sometimes, late at night, he would hear the distant echo of heavy footsteps and feel the cold breath of someone standing just behind him, whispering his name. Thank you for joining us in these chilling tales from the graveyard shift. From eerie phone calls to haunted hallways, these stories remind us that some things are better left undisturbed. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more spine-tingling stories. And remember, the next time you're alone at night, that you might not be alone at all. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.